Well, good morning to the three of our witnesses this morning. We're confining this session literally to the draft Financial Services and Markets Act 2000 Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2019, which are in draft form at the moment and still to be laid. I'm really grateful to the three of you for being here at pretty short notice. I know that the Minister in particular has got the joy of Treasury questions later on in the House.
Warm-up.
This is a warm-up. OK, well, we'll do our best to warm you up. I'm going to ask the three of you to just introduce yourselves and then we'll get straight into it. Minister.
John Glenn, Member of Parliament for Salisbury and Economic Secretary to Treasury and City Minister.
Lovely. Sam.
Sam Woods, Chief Executive of PRA.
Andrew.
Andrew Bailey, Chief Executive of the FCA.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much to say. So, John Glenn, let's start with you.
Yeah.
The Treasury's already laid a large number of statutory instruments relating to Brexit. Could you just tell, without going into the detail of all the SIs, could you just explain, yes, I think we're going to hear for a long time, could you just explain how this SI relates to sort of the overall strategy of the statutory instruments laid already?
Certainly, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, Chair. So, in the Treasury, we are laying 53 statutory instruments for financial services. We've laid 45 of them. 17 of them have been laid and debated. We've got 20 more to debate, and we've got 8 more to lay. This follows the note that we put out on the 27th of June last year, which set out our approach, followed up with the technical note in August, and then on the 8th of October, an explanatory note. And what we've essentially done with all of these statutory instruments is work with regulators and industry, primarily through City UK, who've convened a cross-sectoral representative group, to look at what would be needed to onshore regulations to ensure that in a no-deal circumstance we would have a fully functioning regulatory regime across all sectors. As part of that, we've obviously got temporary permissions regimes in place, but one of the key powers that was mentioned back in June and has been open for scrutiny is this temporary transitional power, which would be given to the regulators in order to mitigate the effect of a heavy burden of the overall effect of all these regulations coming at the same time. Now, I sense that in this unprecedented session of pre-scrutiny of an SI, this is because this is an unusual power. It's an unusual power in an unusual circumstance, one we don't want to have. But what it does is it gives the regulators the appropriate sort of authority to, as regulators, given their role as national competent authorities, and historically they've always translated what's come from the EU into into the city and into regulations, to have that, make that judgment in different sectors about what would be appropriate. And that means really giving the power to delay the implementation of certain requirements for up to 2 years, which is broadly consistent with the implementation period that we hope to secure. So that's the context. Yeah. Essentially, this power sits sort of over, but alongside the other 53 statutory instruments that I'm taking through statutory committees every week for several weeks, and 7 more to go.
And it's particularly in a no-deal situation?
Yes, it's exclusively for a no-deal situation.
Okay.
If I may just add one other aspect of our no-deal planning is the in-flight files bill, which is going through the Lords and we think will come to the Commons next month. Because we need a mechanism to onshore or to consider whether to onshore regulations that are in flight within and in discussion within the EU Commission.
Do you want to just break down in flight? I think.
Well, in flight means essentially they are not concluded, right. So they're not directives and outcomes that are not yet secure, but they are under consideration. And we know when we've been part of, in fact, in many cases, we've been leading that discussion at EU level. So if we leave in a no-deal situation on the 29th of March, there'll be bits of legislation, some of which we'll be hotly anticipating and will nearly have landed, and some which will be an earlier stage of gestation. And that provision in legislation, if passed, which we hope it will give us the discretion of whether to introduce some or all of those different directives. So that's the Treasury's approach, really, and we've done that in a very collaborative way, working with the PRA and the FCA, but also with representatives of the different financial services industry members, so that we actually do this in the right way. And typically we've we've published them for scrutiny before we've then laid them in Parliament and then debated them under the powers of the EU withdrawal.
Now, I think we can understand why the powers are needed, but as you say, these are unprecedented, which is why this is an unprecedented session, really, of the Treasury Select Committee. So perhaps I'll just turn to FCA and the PRA, obviously. You've heard the Minister's explanation, and particularly this issue about mitigating, I think, as he put it, the heavy burden of rules coming on, being onshored all at the same time. So perhaps, Andrew, if I could start with you, what are in that situation, what would be the changes, and again, without perhaps going into minuscule detail, the broad sweep of changes that the FCA would need to make to your rule books?
So to give you an example, today, obviously, as a member of the EU, typically under EU legislation, there's a sort of set of rules which govern, say, the transaction between an institution in the UK and an institution in another EU country. And those can be different and often less burdensome than the rules that govern a transaction between the UK and an institution outside the EU. Mm-hmm. The effect of the onshoring is to make the EU so this sounds a stupid thing to say, but a non-EU entity, i.e. it makes it a third country.
Yeah.
So the reason that's important is because it means that the burden of, say, of transaction reporting in something like a funds transfer recognition procedure for an EU institution today becomes much greater. Yeah. So, and that affects the systems that firms have, because they have to make changes to those systems to change the reporting that's captured. And they will need time to do that. Now, in some of the SIs, we've been able to, in a sense, particularly the ones that came in earlier, we've been able to, in a sense, put that into the SIs themselves. So in the MiFID SI, quite a lot of that of what we're debating today is actually already in the MiFID SI, although actually it's often the same. In substance, it's a very similar effect, i.e. it gives powers to waive and vary the application of these requirements. But there's two things that we're concerned about. Obviously, there's one is that firms do need time to adjust, whether it's their own systems or whether it's when they're using third-party suppliers. They have to get third-party suppliers to do things. Two, some of these are now very late, obviously late in the day changes, were there, as the Minister says, this is the case of a hard exit. And thirdly, there is also what I would call the sort of the unknown, unpredictable stuff, where we think we've done this work, we think we've got a pretty good view of the landscape, but I'm afraid I can pretty much guarantee you some stuff will come up, and we do need to have often we need to have the ability to deal with that quite quickly. Yeah.
Okay. Sam, how about from your perspective?
So our general approach is exactly in line with what Andrew just described for the FCA, so I won't repeat that. Maybe I can just add two bits of colour.
And any example, if you've got anything that you think,
So I'll give you perhaps one example, but also perhaps to give you a sense of the scale of what we're doing here, because I think that is important, and that's part of the motivation for the unusual nature of the power. So if you look at all the onshoring changes across the statutory instruments, the rules that we're changing ourselves and binding technical standards, we're not talking about hundreds of changes. It is thousands and thousands of changes. So if you just look at the PRA side, and if we isolate only 6 of those statutory instruments that the Economic Secretary mentioned, between those and the changes we're making to rules and binding technical standards, that's 850 pages of changes, each of which will have many changes on them. If you bring in Andrew's side, even leaving aside the statutory instruments, it's another 1,600 pages of changes. So this is a massive operation, and the reason we think we need such a power is partly in view of the scale. And because of the Brexit timetable, necessarily, and despite very fast and hard work by everybody involved, those changes are going to land quite late before exit day. And we would never normally make changes on that scale and say to firms that you've got a few weeks to change. We just wouldn't do it. The level of operational risk in that is very high. And just to add you one more example from the prudential side, one of the things that will change, it's a bit like what Andrew is describing in his context, is the treatment of exposures of UK banks and insurance companies to EU 27 institutions of one sort or another, including sovereigns. That changes because it moves to a third country basis. Now that decision, move to third country, is for Parliament. It's in one of the statutory instruments, and we think it's absolutely right that it should move to third country. But making that change in firms has to be done carefully. It has to go through the proper risk processes, proper governance, all that kind of stuff, because they don't want to get their numbers wrong. This affects their reported capital ratio. So it seems to me that in the no-deal scenario, the very last thing that we need is for banks and insurance companies to be uncertain about what their published capital ratios are.
Okay, thank you. we're going to come back, I think, and look at some more specific details, but I just want to, before I hand over to Charlie, Minister, I originally the Leader of the House asking that this SI is debated on the floor of the House, the main chamber, as opposed to up in one of the committees through the usual delegated legislation procedure. Does the Treasury have a view on the level of, setting aside this session, the level of parliamentary scrutiny that is
well,
needed?
I mean, the level of parliamentary scrutiny will be a matter for the House to determine. I mean, I've taken numerous statutory instruments, and I've got, I think, 5 more next week. I've got another one on Wednesday, and I take them where I need to take them. The bottom line is that there's a clear rationale for this. Industry wants it. If you look at the Miles Selich's comments, they're very supportive of this process, and there's been a degree of collaboration and cooperation between the regulators, myself representing the government, and industry players to try and get this right. Although I accept Andrew's observation around there will always be unforeseen outcomes.
I think one of the other things that we're aware of, I think is perhaps a broader point, of course, there's the MEPs, members of the European Parliament at the moment, have a veto over EU regulator rule changes, and obviously that includes UK MEPs as well. If the UK has to implement changes made in future as a result of changes made by EIOPA or ESMA, then it's potentially that MEPs in Brussels will have a vote on those changes, but UK politicians won't. Are you concerned? Has there been discussion in the Treasury about whether that creates a democratic deficit?
Well, I think we need to be clear about what we're talking about here, because these SIs are referring to onshoring regulations that are already subject to through the EU.
So they've already been scrutinised by the
They've already
MEPs.
been scrutinised by the process you've described. What you're describing is the challenge that we would face in the event of a no-deal hard Brexit in terms of how we would do that scrutiny in future.
Yeah.
That's really outside the scope of this exercise. So I think last Friday your committee set out that you plan to look at future financial services regulation. I'll be very happy to come back for my 10th Select Committee appearance if
Can't
you wish,
stay away.
on that. But that is a separate matter.
Yeah.
Now,
Okay.
It would be fair to draw an equivalence from that description and British Parliament, UK Parliament. If we were doing anything new, we're not. We're just onshoring to create a steady state consistent with where firms are at the moment. But you're right to say we would need to resolve that, and that would need a serious and urgent work from the Treasury working with regulators on that basis.
And if I could also just answer that, because I agree with John on this. I mean, first of all, of course, as John said, the guiding principle here is to, if we have to use these powers, to put the system back, or to keep it where it is today.
Yeah.
It's sort of interesting. I was looking at the debate around the sort of medical procedures, which is actually, to my mind, quite more radical than what we're doing, because that's changing things. We're actually trying to hold it where it is until we can put the changes through on onshoring. The second thing, it goes, I think, exactly to your point about the European Parliament, is that, to my mind, the sort of, in a sense, the controls in this process, which involve both government and Parliament in terms of both transparency and us having to, in a sense, get your consent for what we're doing, are actually stronger, I have to tell you, than what we would do in rulemaking in the non-EU space today.
So we'll look at that too then.
I think that goes to John's point about what is the future. I mean, that's that's what's the future going to look like. This is fixing the
exactly.
This is fixing the sort of the emergency, as it were, or the contingency. I think there is a much broader point, which we've touched on occasionally in these hearings, about what the future looks like. But that's a much bigger point.
Can I just say on that, Chair, that there's a considerable amount of work going on in the Treasury to look at all scenarios, and I'm not in any way reluctant to come before your committee to talk about that, and it's linked to the scrutiny of the 5-yearly process. But given that we haven't secured parliamentary time and we haven't got to conclusions on that discussion yet, that I don't feel that now is the time to discuss that.
No, we've got all those future discussions to look forward to. We would never say, John, that you would ever be unwilling to appear before this committee, and I will put that on the record. Charlie.
John, good morning.
Good morning, Charlie.
The regulators are obviously independent of the Treasury, rightly so. But what checks has the Treasury put into the system to ensure that regulators are not making material changes or straying into areas which are more the competence of the Treasury?
Well, actually, this whole process has been underpinned by deep cooperation between industry representatives and City UK, I mention again, have been absolutely instrumental in that, and then representatives from the PRA and the FCA with the Treasury. We've worked collaboratively to understand the concerns and then respond to them, to lay them for consideration. And in terms of the legal drafting and so on, there's been a process where there's been space to comment and to improve that. But I would just point out that the FCA and PRA are not these organisations are not free to act without parliamentary scrutiny. They were set up with statutory objectives, and there's no sense that they are allowed to move beyond that. And indeed, what we can say is that when it comes to the FSMA threshold conditions, company law or accounting standards, or, for example, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, they will not be able to be suspended in any way. There are basic statutory obligations. So what we've seen is a deep collaboration and dialogue to get this right for the industry. That's been my objective, that in a no-deal situation, we won't have vast parts of financial services saying, well, we didn't know what was happening. Though I've always pressed the desirability of a deal, and I still maintain that, my job as a junior Treasury Minister is to deliver this for the financial services sector.
Sam, Section 203(2) of the draft SI states that, which I'm sure you've read in detail,
I have.
States that the regulators don't have to publish the changes to a direction, transitional direction, if the regulator is satisfied that it would be inappropriate. How could the publication of changes be inappropriate? And if you don't publish, how will the people who are affected know?
So I'd like to answer that directly, and then if I might add a tiny bit of colour to what the Economic Secretary said, how it looks from the regulator's end of the pipe, as it were. So the first is, my expectation is that we're going to publish all of these. That's, I think, where we are most likely to be. I would be very surprised indeed if we do not publish in draft form all of the directions that we make currently scheduled for the end of February, which is the upfront use of this power. And it may be that is the only use we make of this power, or it may be, as Andrew says, that there are bugs we need to iron out later. The reason there is a possibility allowed of non-publication is that follows directly the convention which is already established in law for what we do for waivers. So when firms apply to us for waivers for rules, we typically do publish the waiver that we grant them if we grant them a waiver, but we do have the ability not to publish. The reason that ability is there is just in case there is some commercial sensitivity which could prejudice the interests of the organisations involved, or some other malign effect of that kind. So the thought experiment here is to say, although I'm not expecting to have to do that, the thought experiment here is, imagine in the way we use the transitional power, if granted it by Parliament, we find out that there's a little bit of a bug in it. It doesn't work for a subset of firms, and we need to make a little tweak. But if it became known in the market that that problem was there, they could be traded against. That's the sort of situation in which we might need to do it. It is, however, clear on the face of the SI, to my reading of it, that we have to make that position obviously clear to the firms involved. So we're bound to do that, and we would obviously do that the same way as we do with the waiver. Could I possibly, just at the risk of being too long an answer, just add a tiny bit in terms of the constraints on us? Because although this is a very unusual power, and therefore, of course, there's a strong degree of parliamentary interest, from the regulator's point of view, it does feel very constrained, appropriately constrained. And the most important bit of that is that the main thing we're doing with the SIs and the changes to our rules and binding technical standards is getting from A to B, B being the onshore rules and these things being all the tweaks we need to make just to make it operable. Parliament is deciding all of the important bits of that, what B is, through the statutory instrument process. The Treasury will approve, if it chooses to, and it has the right to approve or reject, all of the changes we're making further down in the stack of regulations. And the transitional power is only about the journey from A to B and how we effectively phase that in, which in the vast majority of cases will simply be to delay and say, okay, take the EU27 exposure example, you can stick on that for now and change in further down the track. So it is narrow in that respect.
Okay. And Andrew, I briefly want to ask you about a case that's affected my constituents who's lost £500,000 in the collapse of Premier FX. The firm was able to misrepresent its authorisation, which was for remittances, and effectively presented themselves as a deposit taker. How were they able to act beyond their authorisation?
Well, if that is indeed what they did, and there's a strong suspicion that's what they did, it's illegal, first of all. So we are, as you probably know, I think you know, carrying out an investigation. I am very concerned that obviously, the money of individuals has been lost in this activity. My team has so far, I can tell you, looked at nearly a quarter of a million transaction records to try and trace this money, and we will not stop doing that. But I would say to you quite honestly, the people who, you probably know, the principal involved in this activity is said to be dead. I think it is incumbent upon his relatives, his business partners, to tell us where the money is.
And in 2017, the Bank of Portugal fined Premier FX. No, this matters on the regulations. I'll explain why it fits the regulations.
Really?
So, yes. So in 2017, the Bank of Portugal fined Premier FX for trading outside the regulations and compliance with its licence in Portugal and reported that to the FCA. There was no follow-up by the FCA under safeguarding regulations. Why was the breach not detected? And under these regulations, in a no-deal scenario, how would we make sure that there was such independent international supervisory cooperation?
Well, I've said we will look thoroughly at the record of this case, but the first priority is to find the money, frankly, because that's what we owe to the victims, and that is my first priority. If we missed clues in this case, particularly in the reauthorisation process under the European Payment Services Directive, we will look at that. I have to also say, as you rightly point out, I don't know which jurisdiction some of this activity went on in yet, because it crosses over between the UK and Portugal, but we will look at that. Now, insofar as it comes, I think the gist of your question then comes back to how in a transitional regime we would have the safeguards in place. Well, we learned the lessons from what's happened in the past. We will have to work very closely, and we are currently in the business. Both Sam and I are in the business of negotiating MOUs with the EU authorities in the event that this situation comes to pass, to enable us to have access to information and do our job. And we take that very seriously, and we will obviously continue to take it very seriously, because the effect of the transitional arrangements is to effectively, recreate the passporting system for a period of time while we can sort things out. And I can assure you that during that time, we obviously have to take our supervisory responsibilities very seriously, yes.
And do these regulations, do they look at extending the financial compensation scheme so that where people lose money, in case if they're not currently covered, it might be extended?
Well, no, these regulations do not extend the FSCS. I think, as the Minister said, what is very clear is that we can't use the SI that we're talking about to reduce the coverage and the effect of the FSCS. We have to meet the objectives that are given to us, of which the FSCS forms an important part. So to be clear on that. Any decisions on the scope of the FSCS beyond that are a matter, frankly, for this Parliament. But I would just come back to the points I mentioned earlier, that this, on the face of it, this is a legal activity.
Yes. And, Andrew, under Section 203(2) of the draft statutory instrument on this issue about whether you publish or don't publish, without publication, how can other stakeholders, or not just those directly impacted, be aware of changes that regulators are making to UK legislation?
So I'd make the same, reinforce the point that Sam made. So the presumption is we publish. And my strong presumption personally is I would have to have a very, very strong argument put to me to not do so. I think, as Sam said, the strong argument would have to be that actually we were cutting across other legal obligations that we have in the UK statute. Sam made the point about commercial, revealing commercial confidences, which we're not allowed to do under the UK statute. But I can tell you in the same spirit, it would have to, the bar is very high here to not publish.
Okay. Stuart.
Thank you. First off, you've said that this SI is designed to be used exclusively in the circumstances of a no-deal Brexit.
Yeah.
But in part 1, right at the beginning, citation, commencement, interpretation 1.2, this regulation, part 7, 8 and the following list of regulations come into force the day after the day on which these regulations are made, but the bulk of it doesn't come into force until what's known as exit day. So if it's designed exclusively for a no-deal Brexit situation, why do some of the regulations kick into force potentially earlier than that?
Well, I mean, the situation is until we get a deal, we need to make provision to lay all of these statutory instruments. In a situation where we secure a deal, then they would all fall away because we wouldn't need to use them.
Sorry, would they fall away or would they simply not need to be used because these are different things?
Well, that would be a matter for the government to decide. We would find a collective way of dealing with all the statutory instruments that we've laid, but we wouldn't.
Either that we would repeal them.
Well, that is my expectation. Yeah.
Okay, but that isn't clear yet because we don't know the circumstances.
Yeah, we don't know the circumstances. Basically, I've got to deliver all of this by the end of March, and that's what I'm doing.
I understand that. Now, the powers can only be used for 2 years. Why is that?
Well, it's broadly in line with the implementation period that would have been anticipated under securing a deal, and that is a reasonable period also for us to then actually secure in a no-deal circumstance what the end state would need to be. And we've got to take a view about what is actually proportionate and reasonable. Clearly, we'd be in uncharted territories if we had no deal. I accept that, and that would mean, as I say, urgent work to establish an alternative.
Can I just add briefly to that? So it also comes back to the scale of what we're looking at here. We've had to make a judgment. So usually when we're making changes of this scale, we allow quite a long time for firms to get used to them.
I was going to ask you that. How long would that sort of scale of change?
Well, let me give you 2 examples. There's obviously no perfect analogy because we've never done anything like this exactly before. But for the ring fence, which we discussed when I was here last week, came in on the 1st of January. That's effectively a 4-year process, actually an 8-year process from the recommendations of the Independent Commission. Basel III, which is a set of prudential changes going through right now, some of that has an 8-year phase-in. I don't think this is analogous to those 2. No. It's very big, but it's a lot of high volume of quite small things mostly. So our view has been that it'd be reasonable within a 2-year period to require firms to get there. It might even be possible for them to get there a bit sooner, but I think it might be sensible to have a little bit of runway at the end in case we've misjudged it.
I really want to probe consistency, because the EEA Passport Rights Amendment, etc., transitional provisions, EU exit regulations 2018, as an example, their explanatory notes show that EEA firms have temporary passports for up to 3 years after exit date. And the Treasury has the power to extend both the length of the regime and those deadlines by no more than 12 months at a time, but not simply restricted to 1 year. So why do these powers, which are substantial, why have they effectively fixed at 2 years when the starting point for other related legislation is 3 years with annual extensions as required? There's an inconsistency there. That's all I'm trying to
They are different, but there is a reason for that. And the reason for that is that the temporary permissions regime is doing really quite a different thing from the transitional power in relation to the onshoring. So the 3 years in the temporary permissions regime, and by the way, I think from our point of view at the prudential end, this is the single most important thing Parliament has done to de-risk the cliff edge, is to give those firms who are currently trading here using passporting and who wish to stay in a significant form time to get ready for the full process of authorisation to be here in the UK permanently. And that is, as you, I think, would expect, a heavy-duty process. And the view we've taken is that 3 years is an appropriate time to give firms to get ready for that. Some will, of course, be able to get there quicker. The transitional SI is about giving all firms, it's a much larger number of firms, time to get ready for that number of changes. And as I say, we formed the judgment that 2 years should be enough. We've been consulting on this, by the way, and I would say the responses we've had have been very supportive, some perhaps pushing for a bit longer, but my judgment is 2 years would be enough.
You said that the Basel implementation lead-in time, 8 years, wasn't really analogous with this. And I think you're right, because we're talking about negotiations rather than delivery. I suppose it's more analogous to negotiating a trade deal. What happens if we haven't negotiated a trade deal on financial services with the EU within the 2-year period? What happens to this temporary regime?
Well, this whole architecture is around no deal, and as I said earlier, we are in a situation of an unprecedented situation.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Sorry.
Yes, you're right. It's about no deal, but let's be generous and say it's an uncompleted deal. And it's going to take 3 or 4 years to negotiate. You've got a gap at the end. What do you do?
Well, I mean, you're asking us to explore, circumstances which are not yet clear. What we've done so far is we've actually worked with industry collaboratively with the regulators to establish what is an appropriate mechanism to bring a smooth transfer as possible in a no-deal circumstance. If we find that we are in need of further changes later on, then that will be a matter for those circumstances. But I'm not going to be drawn into speculations of 2 or 3 years hence. I mean, the government's position is that we wish to secure a deal with a transition period of 20 months, and that is what we are working towards. Now, this discussion this morning is about the no-deal scenario, and as Sam set out, and there's a reason for that differentiation in time frame. It's not muddled thinking. It's based on an assessment of what the market can stand and needs in order to minimise friction and uncertainty during this rather undesirable outcome.
Well, if I may, I think the key point here is that uncertainty around any subsequent negotiation doesn't actually have a bearing on how long it takes to fix the technical issues, to complete the onshoring of EU legislation into the UK. Those two things, as Sam was saying, are separate.
But that's prejudging the outcome of the negotiations.
Well, it's separating. It's separate. No, it's not prejudging. It's separating the two things. It's saying that the completion of the onshoring is not connected to whatever the UK's future relationship.
Okay, let me ask you about the onshoring then, and once we get to that point. Is it the intention that all EU-based firms will have set up a UK-domiciled entity prior to these new powers expiring, or that they'll have simply stopped trading here?
I mean, that would be a matter for them.
Yeah.
I mean, the regulator's job is not to determine a desirable configuration of EU firms. I mean, the fact is that the City of London is a global centre of finance and a high desirable place to be, and it would be inconceivable that won't continue. And what we've seen in Sam's assessment of contingency arrangements is borne out to be true. They're very modest, based on the fact that actually the need to retain presence in London is absolutely paramount for most and many EA firms, despite pulls to Frankfurt, Luxembourg or wherever else. So, we will do everything we can to maintain the competitiveness and desirability to locate in London.
I think what you're going to have is firms who want to be here in big form with an established presence will largely use the temporary permissions regime. There's one exception to that, which is where we've required firms to be in a subsidiary, which is basically a retail business, and some of those have already been authorised. And then there is another statutory instrument, which is actually a very important one. It's probably the next most important one for us after the one we're discussing today, which is for run-off schemes. So if you've got firms who basically want to get out but need to run down, we've got two different versions of that, and that again is coming to you for a decision in due course.
And one final question to Mr. Bailey and Mr. Woods. Once this SI is approved, if it's approved, how long will it take for both of your agencies to make all the necessary changes to deliver the intent of this? Andrew?
Well, it does, of course, depend on completing the rest of the SIs in that sense, that we do need to see the whole picture, but we're on course to have all of this ready.
What's the single point What's the single biggest point of risk then? If there's an SI uncompleted, which one would it be?
Well, I have to be honest with you, the single biggest point of failure is that Parliament doesn't make all the SIs.
I'll take that.
But, you know, I've got complete faith in John, you know, and all of you. But no, seriously, I mean, obviously, if, you know, we've actually got 62 SIs in all, which is 50, John's 53 plus 9 with other departments. The whole edifice does have to hang together in that sense. So that's probably the single biggest risk. If all of that follows, then, as Sam was saying earlier, we'll make the necessary directions in time for the end of March, on the basis it goes ahead, obviously, and that's the point John was making earlier.
Yes, our planning date is very end of February. That's when we think we can get it done. So if we hit that, what we'll be dropping on that day is draft directions under the use of the power we're discussing today, if that power is granted, and then our position on all of the detailed things we've been talking about, which we've been consulting on with the industry, but also, crucially, some plain English guidance to explain to firms, you know, looking through all of this complexity, you know, what are the main things they need to be aware of.
And that work's underway.
That work has been heavily underway for the best part of 2 years, and is a truly ginormous exercise. And you're seeing, it's more than the tip of the iceberg, it's the top third of the iceberg through the statutory instruments, and there's another 2/3 underneath that.
I'm slightly amused in every debate on an SI. John gets asked if we've got enough resources, and in one sense my question is, that was a good question 2 years ago.
But you've got 158 people on Brexit, up from 28 in March last year, so you've obviously ramped up considerably.
Sunk a lot of resource into this one.
As I've always said, Brexit is good for the lawyers. So before I hand over to Simon, just want to return to one of the things the questions that Stuart asked about the intention that all EU-based firms will have set up UK-domiciled entities, and I fully appreciate that that is a matter for the firms to make the decisions. But you would agree that this SI is important in sending out a signal that London and the financial services sector in the UK is prepared for all eventualities. I mean, that's part of the reason for having all this deal or no deal, I feel like Noel Evans there, having the SIs in place is an important message to the world.
I mean, the dominant message I have is that we need to secure a deal. That's desirable, but equally it will be, you know, imprudent and irresponsible not to have a fully functional regime in a no-deal situation. So, you know, we've had a programme of work, as Sam just said, over 2 years to make sure we've done this in a collaborative way as possible, with as much sort of common sense. And, you know, we've been proactive as well in terms of giving permissions to the EU, regardless of what they've done. Yeah.
Well, a number of us are working on getting that deal in place. So, before I hand over to Simon, I wanted to ask the regulator, so Andrew and Sam. Obviously, I mean, Sam, you mentioned earlier on about waiver powers for some things. Did you look at whether, in fact, those powers might be sufficient? The question again: new SI, additional powers. Are there powers that you've already got that could have done the job?
Yeah, we looked at that question and we concluded they were not sufficient for two main reasons. One, and by far the most important, is that, of course, we cannot use our waiver power to make changes to legislation that's agreed in Parliament, and that's why this power is unusual. And that's probably the most important point. And we don't really consider it practicable to tease apart, in the use of such a transitional power, the bits that are coming through the parliamentary process and the bits that are going on further down the stack. Because unfortunately, the nature of EU rulemaking is such that these things are all heavily intertwined. So that is one difference. The second is back to the scale point. And in particular, you'll see that in one of the clauses in the statutory instrument that this is described as an own initiative power. And what that means is, and this also goes to the point of resourcing, that we can use it off our own initiative. So we can take the step to use it. Now, there is that possibility within the waiver power, but what we want to avoid is firms having to apply for the right to have this transitional, because frankly we'll then be completely swamped in that process. It serves no purpose. So for us it was very clear, for consistency, because of the volume, and to capture the bits that we aren't normally in control of, that we needed to do that.
It would also create uncertainty, I think, if firms had to apply for it, whereas what we want to do is to make it quite clear at the outset this is what the landscape looks like.
And just actually by analogy, so the FCA in September 2017 chose not to enforce all of the MiFID II immediately by taking a and by not taking a strict liability approach. Again, was that an approach that was feasible?
Well, that's not unusual. I mean, the EU, this is really a comment on the EU actually, so the EU doesn't have ability to, in a sense, formally to take no action under its rules. But when you're introducing something as big as MiFID, and we discussed this in the ESMA board quite a lot actually, I mean, you do have to make what I might call pragmatic choices about how fast you introduce the supervisory regime. Now, there's been obviously quite a lot of commentary on this, and quite strident commentary on this in public. And let's be clear, we're not disapplying MiFID. I think, as I said in the last hearing we had 2 weeks ago,
yes,
we're going to come out very soon with our own assessment of what firms have done, and it will be critical in places. Let's be clear on that. But our whole approach is to work with firms to get the arrangements in place. And MiFID was it's the biggest change, I think, in wholesale financial market regulation in my memory, certainly. So, our approach is pragmatic in that sense. Now, not everybody agrees with that. I'm well aware of that. But we think that is a sensible way to do it.
Thank you. Simon.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone. In terms of the scope of these regulations, the wording is that the changes are going to be limited to those needed to prevent or mitigate disruption. How will the Treasury, John, be assessing whether or not a change does indeed prevent or mitigate disruption? What's the definition of that?
Well, I mean, we will be notified of decisions made, and I think in the letter that I wrote on the 17th of January, the copies of the directions laid will be given made available for Parliament to see, and there'll be an annual report that will report on that. I mean, obviously, we'll listen very carefully to the observations of this committee with respect to the sufficiency of that. But, I think I go back to the basis by which this power has been conceived, to deliver in unique circumstances an appropriate intervention that suits the market needs, not giving discretion in a sort of convenience of market actors, but in terms of the actual what's the optimal outcome that keeps the obligations of the regulators for competitiveness, for actually detriment and systemic risk to the market. Now, the system that we've created in this country relies on the regulators taking those decisions in the market. They are, and the people that work in those environments are much better capable than myself or individual MPs to make a judgment of what's necessary. But what we can then do is say, well, through primary legislation, we set these objectives, and we can then look at the experience in the ground, having tasked the regulator to take that decision. But there's no, real sense of, in my mind, that we are not having an appropriate level of scrutiny through seeing what's been laid, through the report. It would just be impractical on a case-by-case basis for us we wouldn't be able to evaluate. We wouldn't have the functional skills to do that.
No, that's helpful to have on the record, thank you. In terms of new issues, because of course it's not a static environment as we know, if new rules are issued by the EU which could provide such disruption, will the regulators be able to use these new powers to address those concerns, even if they don't exist at the moment? So,
again, in a situation of a no deal, what would then apply is the in-flight files bill, which is essentially, as I said earlier, this mechanism to give us the power to decide what to implement or what parts to implement. That would be a decision that we would make. But I cannot overemphasise that in a no deal situation, how different the world would be. At the moment, such a vast majority of our regulations in financial services derive from the EU and ESMA, and they are sort of permeate through to the Treasury and to the regulators. Without that block taken out at the top of the page, as it were, we've got a significant challenge. I'm sure we will be able to find a way, but we are really turning our back on something that has been fundamentally part of the way that we do and deliver regulations.
On the in-flight legislation, of course, we would, as we always do, we would consult on the implementation of that legislation. Part of any consultation we do is to obviously bottom out exactly how long it reasonably takes to implement it. That's what we always do.
To be clear, is the in-flight legislation restricted to material which is literally in flight at the point of our departure, or is it all material going forward?
They're listed on the face of the bill, so when it comes to the Commons, I hope in a few weeks, you'll be able to see them.
That's right. I said briefly on the former point that it's clear on the face of the SI that we can only use this power if granted it where it attaches to relevant obligations which are defined as onshoring changes. Yes. That's really a huge narrowing. Where we're satisfied there's a risk of reasonable expectation of disruption if we don't use the power, and also where it doesn't adversely affect our objectives. And we are going to apply those tests, and indeed one example of something that we're not going to use this for is for bail-in debt. So bail-in debt is what we need to stand between the taxpayer and losses in banks, and having looked at that, we see no reason why from exit day for new bail-in debt banks shouldn't insert a clause that allows us to bail it in even if the EU is a third country. We don't think that's particularly disruptive, and we think that not having that could adversely affect our objectives. So that's the spirit in which we'll approach it.
Okay. John, as part of the, this is a wonderful name for an SI, the financial regulators' powers, brackets, technical standards, etc., brackets, amendments, etc., brackets, EU exit, brackets, regulations 2018 SI, passed in October. The payment systems regulator was given additional powers to fix deficiencies within its remit. Why has it not been given the same powers as the bank and the FCA in this latest SI?
Well, what you've got is a whole set of SIs pertaining to different parts of financial services regulation. What we're talking about this one today is an overall power to mitigate the effects of the combined effect of those coming into power, effect at the same time. So I'm not sure as I can recollect that particular debate.
Possibly worth adding that unlike the PRA and the FCA, for which the governing legislation is FSMA, Financial Services Markets Act, Payments Services Regulation is FSBRA, different piece of legislation. And I'm not going to have to read this out, I'm sorry, my ignorance. Financial Services Banking Reform Act 2013. So you need a slightly different process for the PSR than you do for the PRA and the FCA.
Thank you, Andrew.
That's okay. I'm a member of the board of the PSR, so it's sort of incumbent on me.
I'm not.
I cast absolutely no aspersions for not having that on the tip of your tongue.
Effort going on there, I think,
The wheels were grinding.
Thank you.
In terms of the consultation process which is envisaged as part of all of this, so a regulator, before it gives a transitional direction, must consult the Treasury on a draft of the proposed direction, which goes back to your point, I suppose, John, about the fact that you don't necessarily have all the technical expertise of the Treasury to assess everything, but there is a sort of consultative element. What would happen if the Treasury did disagree with a regulator on the need to make a transitional direction? I appreciate that's probably an unlikely contingency, but nonetheless.
Well, I mean, it is an unlikely contingency because there's usually an iterative process. I mean, there's consultation with industry, and then the Treasury and my officials would work with myself and the regulators to work out what the right outcome is. And I think that is the way it works. It works in a consensual way. I mean, it's not a question of black and white. Ideologically different.
It's designed never to get to that position.
Well, it's designed to create maximum consensus to find the right solution for the market. I haven't encountered. I mean, there are differences of emphasis, and I meet with Sam and Andrew regularly on a whole range of matters, but they are appropriately independent as Parliament is defined, but there's a dialogue on the matters that are not.
That's really helpful. There is a caveat to that, which is that Section 202 of the draft SI states that regulators don't need to complete a consultation prior to giving a direction if they assess that the urgency of the situation is such that the direction should be given before the required consultation is begun or consulted. Now, the Bank of England issued a consultation on these powers in October. The Treasury's plans apparently have been known since June last year. Why haven't those consultations been finalised at this point?
I can say a word about that. So we have had two consultations. One is the October one, in which we talk specifically about the approach we intend to take to the use of the transitional power approved by Parliament, and then a much more detailed consultation in December covering all of the changes that we are making. You'll readily see that in order to finalise that before exit day, we have had to compress timescales somewhat. We've had a lot of responses. We have 40 responses, a lot of engagement on those. We're currently considering it. As I said, plan is to be able to get to the end point on that by the end of February. I mean, that's frankly as fast as it can go, and I think that gives firms reasonable visibility and reasonable notice of what's going to happen.
Okay. How will urgent be defined for the purposes of something? I appreciate that's perhaps a plain English reading of it, but I'm just trying to understand the extraordinary circumstances in which no consultation would be required.
So I think, to be honest with you, I think we will take it in its plain English reading, because we're not going to know until it hits us. It's basically there for if we've missed something. So there's just something that we somehow didn't capture, or we captured it in a way that turns out not to work, and you've got a problem that's going to crystallise at the end of the day and you just need to do it fast. We're not obviously expecting that, but I think given the scale of what we're doing here, it's wise to allow for that possibility.
I'll give you an example from last year, if it would help, and it's actually a MiFID example. It's a so-called Swiss tick size issue. So almost on the first day that MiFID was implemented, we realised there was a problem, and that MiFID was overly rigid on the so-called tick size of equity trading, and that the Swiss market would have had to migrate out of London almost intraday. And we went in intraday. Actually, the Germans did the same thing intraday. We did it in collaboration and fixed it intraday.
Yeah.
You don't have to do that. Fortunately, you don't do that most days, but occasionally, things just happen.
No, indeed. No, that's really helpful. Thank you all very much indeed.
So, John, you mentioned before this annual report and the publication, and so just to get on the record, you obviously wrote to me, as you say, on the 17th of January, and can you just confirm that you do intend that copies of the directions will be laid in the libraries of both Houses of Parliament? I think you just said that, actually. And your right to bring any direction to the attention of this committee, but you've also talked about an annual report to Parliament explaining how the powers have been exercised. Between the three of you, have you given any thought to how that will be reported, when the first report would be? Is there any further detail you can give on that?
Well, I mean, we want to be as helpful and transparent as possible within the context of the use of the powers as we've discussed this morning. That seems to me a reasonable way forward. And as I say, if the committee have some observations on the frequency of that, then we will address that. There's no desire to hide anything. I mean, I think we've covered it, situations where immediate urgent interventions are needed. Why it wouldn't be appropriate for decision by decision scrutiny in Parliament, but we felt that is a reasonable way forward, and if there are any further changes, then we look at those constructively.
Sam?
Yes, so I have been looking at this. My reading of the SI is that the way that it attaches our annual reporting obligation to this particular piece is it's therefore hardwired into the SI.
Right.
And my understanding of how that bit of law works is it attaches on a calendar year basis, so we would have to provide an annual report after the end of the first calendar year in which we had the power. Okay. Having said that, I think by far the most important publication we'll do this is likely to be the thing at the end of February, when that will set out, here's how we plan to use it. And we may not need to use it again after that. If we do, hopefully it will be for sort of infrequent issues. So I think maybe that first very broad publication will actually be the more important one.
I mean, that's the question, is how often do you think you're going to have to use this? And I suppose would the annual report be an opportunity perhaps to give a summary of when requests have been made, when there are actions, rather than listing each direction?
Yes, I mean, we'd want it to be, and we sort of obviously aim for this standard in all of our annual reporting, an intelligible account of what we've been doing. It may be that as I say, the only use we have to make is the upfront use.
Yeah.
But then we've got the ability to use it subsequently. There's also a very important clause within the SI which allows us to vary a direction once we have given it, which again would be public, subject to the caveat I was discussing earlier. And that I think is also important, just in case the way that we've done it turns out not quite to deal with the issue we've been concerned about.
I think the only thing I would add is that, and this again, I think to John's point, I think we'd welcome your thoughts on this, frankly, is that, as Sam says, I think the initial report should cover most of it. I'd be sort of surprised if we get much thereafter. I think the second issue is how we sort of, in a sense, report on when it sunsets, effectively.
Yeah.
So how we sort of, in a sense, taking each of them off. And over what part? Because we said, I mean, it's 2 years, but actually we may not, may not use the full 2 years. I mean, because we're going to take a view on how long it takes. We're not going to leave it out there for excessively long periods of time.
Rosemary, have you got a final question?
Good morning. Well, I want to start with a positive. I just want to record my thanks to the Minister on the mortgage prisoners issue. I know there are a couple of more outstanding issues which we raised with Mr Bailey, but thank you for taking that up, and to your officials. I have one question outstanding related to SIs, which is whether the Treasury will produce an impact assessment for this SI. You'll know from the last committee we were on that there wasn't one, and I'm quite concerned that there is an issue about members of Parliament having enough information to be able to scrutinise whether it happens in committees or on the floor of the House. So can you give a commitment that there will be an impact assessment for this SI?
Well, all I can say is that my officials and myself are committed to doing everything we can to meet the requirements. The Regulatory Policy Committee are responsible for approving impact assessments, and they rightly expect us to fulfil certain standards. And obviously this is an unusual process. I would say it's a unique process to do this volume of SIs legitimately under the power we've been given. I think it's right to say we've secured green rating for all of those that we've done. You're right to say that you were on a committee where we didn't have one on that instance. I've got one tomorrow afternoon. What we've tried to do with these last batch of 20 is to submit, I think it's 5 overall impact assessments, and each of those cover the individual SIs. It's not in my gift to determine whether the impact assessment is ready. All I can say is that we're in dialogue with the RPC and we're doing everything we can to secure that. I think it's highly undesirable for us to take these SIs through committee without an impact assessment. I think that's something I conceded in the committee, and I have done subsequently on 1 or 2 occasions where that's happened again. But this is about actually trying to make sure that we get that balance between doing what's necessary in the time frame. But your point you made before, which was this is not aiding scrutiny, but proper scrutiny, I accept. But we're trying to get that right, and we're doing it as quickly as we can. There's no desire to conceal anything, but there's 354 SIs across government that have been laid out of 600 that will be laid. There's a lot of work going on.
Well, I mean, the RBC has managed to turn around requests for impact assessments, haven't they? So I think, if we are talking about transparency in this unusual set of circumstances, then we do need an undertaking that government departments will produce the SIs, because otherwise it makes a mockery, frankly, of us going to committees, papers being submitted very late in the day, and it's just not possible to scrutinise adequately. So I think it does need to be taken seriously.
Well, I hope I've conveyed that I am taking it seriously.
Yes, but I need a commitment that you're going to make sure there will be an SI for this, there will be an impact assessment for this committee, because otherwise, with respect, I don't think that the issues that I raised in that committee that we both attended and what you're saying now is going to give us enough assurance that we will have the adequate information on the impact assessment to be able to scrutinise government, especially given that you are now going to have incredible amounts of power to do as you please, Minister.
Well, it's not really...
So I think that our constituents and the British people will want to know that we are armed with the information that we need in order to hold you to account, in order to scrutinise appropriately, and I don't think that's a lot to ask.
Okay.
And I don't think that the argument that Whitehall is under pressure is good enough. The government is recruiting a lot of people to do the extra work. If you want to, you are spending a lot of money planning for no deal Brexit, you should spend some money making sure these impact assessments are available for members of Parliament for us to do our jobs properly.
Okay, well indeed we have spent £4 billion since 2016.
Well, how much are you spending
500 million
on making
spent
sure
for
that
1920.
impact assessments are provided to us in time
figure,
so that we can do our jobs properly, because that's what's at stake here. I think that it's a complete waste of time talking about transparency and accountability to Parliament if that basic duty by the Treasury cannot be fulfilled, and that's what I need an assurance from you today.
Well, I can only tell you what I've said before. which is that I and my officials are doing everything we can to meet the appropriately exacting standards of the Regulatory Policy Committee to complete impact assessments in time. I will do everything I can to ensure that in unprecedented circumstances, but I will also take my lead from the industry representatives who tell me that the risks of not having in place an appropriate set of regulations in a no-deal scenario would be far, far worse for industry than
I think we can all agree
and that's
on
really
that.
important.
That's
well, I
not
mean, it's just a
positive.
practical reality of an unprecedented circumstance. And it's not in my gift to determine the time of the publication, but I'm very, very well aware of the timetable of the debates I've got ahead, and I'm doing everything I can to ensure that I meet the requirements you've rightly set out.
Minister, are you able to perhaps write to us on this? You know, when there's an update on the situation or not, and if the issue is around timetabling or speed of getting impact assessments cleared, that's also something else to have on the record.
I just want to be absolutely clear that I'm not making any even hint or suggestion that I regard that the Regulatory Policy Committee are responsible in any way. It's my responsibility and my officials' responsibility. I take that on board, and I'm very happy to write the committee to update them in due course.
Thank you.
Can I thank you all all three of you, very much indeed for being here this morning. Very grateful for your time and the thought. And we do fully appreciate that actually, although this is unprecedented, these powers are needed in order to make sure that our financial services sector works, whatever might happen in the course of the next 59 days. So thank you to all of you, to all your staff, and to everybody behind the process who is making this happen. That doesn't mean we won't have more searching questions, but we do appreciate the work that's gone into this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John.